Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. As a psychologist, I have seen many personality typing systems, but the one that has impressed me the most so far is the Enneagram. A big reason I like it so much is because of its depth and ability to inform people about their blind spots in a shockingly efficient manner. I have seen firsthand how the Enneagram can help people improve their careers, their relationships, and even how they relate to themselves. To help us understand the Enneagram better, I called on one of the top experts in the world, Dr. Beatrice Chestunut. B is a psychotherapist, coach, and business consultant based in San Francisco. She is the author of two of the most authoritative books about the Enneagram in publication today. B has served as president of the International Enneagram Association twice and has studied the Enneagram deeply for over 30 years. So listen in as B and I go deep into one of the fastest tools to self-knowledge, the Enneagram. Dr. B. Chestunut, thank you so much for taking time to be on our program and informing my listeners about the Enneagram. I'll be referring to you as B since we know each other personally.
Good.
But first off, I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about what the Enneagram is. I've been a fan of it for decades, and I've seen it as a useful, actually an incredibly useful tool, both personally and professionally. But could you just break it down? What is the Enneagram?
Sure. So the Enneagram itself is a symbol. It's a 9-pointed star inscribed in a circle. It's an ancient diagram. The diagram itself has a lot of meaning encoded in it. But in the modern era, in the last 40 years or so, it's become the framework for a personality type system based on 3 centers of intelligence: head, heart, and body, and 9 types. 3 types that live more from the head, 3 types that live more from the heart, and 3 types that live more based in the body. And so these 9 types that the Enneagram describes that are interconnected to each other are interesting to learn about if you're working on personal growth, because they give very accurate, detailed portraits of these 9 specific types. And the types descriptions are kind of guides for self-awareness. When you learn your Enneagram type, according to this typology of the Enneagram, you realize that there are some habitual patterns that you're well aware of that you kind of do all the time. But then there are also blind spots and ways that those patterns can be self-limiting in ways that you don't always see. And so the Enneagram kind of highlights both more internal dynamics of each personality that it's helpful to be aware of, but also growth paths that are associated with these distinct personalities. And by learning the Enneagram, it gives you a very powerful tool for developing yourself, becoming more conscious, becoming more empathic for other people, because other people are coming from completely different points of view. And those are clarified too when you learn the 9 types of the Enneagram.
So there might be some skeptics out there thinking, oh gosh, yet another personality typing system. Is this a little woo-woo with his 9 points and a star? And yet major learning institutions and major corporations are using this tool to their advantage. Can you speak to that?
That's a very good point. Yes, I think because the Enneagram describes these types with so much accuracy and depth, that when people really get to know what it is, they can see that it is a powerful tool. Because it's one of those things where when you read the description of your own personality type, it's kind of shocking. I know when I first learned the Enneagram way back in the early 1990, I was just really surprised that anything could describe me to myself with that much clarity and that much just so many details that were just right on, both in terms of what I knew to be true about myself, but also things that I wasn't really aware of, but I became aware of upon learning about the Enneagram.
Yeah, so it sounds like it really shines a light in often shocking ways on perhaps previously spots that you were unaware of, or the person learning about the Enneagram was unaware of. And it works in a corporate atmosphere. I really want listeners to know, are there any corporations that you know of who use it to their advantage?
Many corporations use it to their advantage. I've worked with businesses and teams and leaders for a long time using the Enneagram. And I even wrote a book, I think you know this, the
Yes.
9 Types of Leadership.
Yep.
And for that book, I got permission to interview over 20 leaders that had worked with the Enneagram, both personally and professionally with their teams and organizations. And I interviewed them to ask this exact question. How do you work with the Enneagram? How has it benefited you? And so they told really compelling stories about how they learned about themselves and could be better leaders, and then serve as models for other people to I think when we can be both more aware of, say, our work styles, our preferences and interacting with people, what pushes our buttons, we become much more emotionally intelligent. We can manage our emotions better. And emotional intelligence has been, I think, more and more seen as really a key factor in success in business, in any kind of organization or at every level that you might work at. And within an organization, it helps you to both manage yourself and be clear about what's going on inside you and understand other people better. And when you have a greater degree of emotional intelligence, it makes you easier to work with. And it also makes you more able to navigate challenging situations easier. And it helps you have more job satisfaction as well as to be more effective. Now, I think, of course, the Enneagram, I think sometimes isn't chosen within a company because it is a bit revealing. There is sort of a level of vulnerability that you need to tolerate, when someone finds out, okay, you're a 1 and wow, here are all your traits laid bare.
Positive and negative.
Exactly. But I think what people find out, and I'm actually really happy to see this happening in organizations, at least most of the ones I work with in the US today, is that people are really getting that if they're willing to make themselves a little bit vulnerable, if they can share more about what they think and feel and what their patterns are, it actually yields big dividends in terms of liking who you work with more, overcoming conflicts that seemed irresolvable, and just making things happen in a more smooth way when you're working with other people.
One of the great things that's happened from Brene Brown being so big in the zeitgeist is that she has really taken the stigma out of vulnerability and actually shown that it's a sign of great strength. And it actually makes a person way more relatable when they are willing to be vulnerable. And I imagine that the Enneagram is a great tool to help achieve this.
Definitely. I mean, it's just like when you know someone who's been to therapy,
right,
versus someone who hasn't.
Yep.
It's easier to navigate a relationship with them because they have some practice at being vulnerable, at tolerating talking about some of their inner process with somebody else as a witness or a support or just as someone that you're sharing something with. So you're right to point to Brene Brown. She deserves a lot of credit for sort of normalizing and clarifying that the ability to make yourself vulnerable is not only a strength, but it's also at the heart of what makes relationships work of any kind.
It's so funny to hear you say that. I'm thinking about when I decided I wanted to seek out a life partner. I didn't just want to date. I was going to look for my future wife. And a key criterion was something I loosely referred to as psychological intelligence. I wanted somebody who was just psychologically dialed in. And as you're talking about this, like, have you done therapy? It almost is a gateway to have a deeper conversation or are you familiar with the Enneagram? Yes, we can actually talk about something beyond the superficial now.
Yes.
The Enneagram almost provides a portal to talk about something very deep.
Yes, yes, I think it provides a portal as well as a language.
Right.
It's like sometimes I know that, like if someone in a family learns the Enneagram and they want to share it with their partner, but the partner is resistant, it's like if you don't speak Enneagram, sometimes you get left out of the conversation in certain circumstances. But I think it gives you a language to talk about what's going on inside that actually takes a little bit of the vulnerability out of it, because it's like, okay, this is a personality style. These are coping strategies. These are defensive patterns that we all get in as part of being human. And that if we can name them, if we can understand them, if we can talk about them, it just helps us get to the heart of the matter more quickly, in terms of either getting to know each other or in terms of talking about points of, commonality and difference. And I think it really, it's almost like, I think of the Enneagram as a shortcut in a lot of ways, whether, I use it as a therapist or in relationships or in a business setting. It's a shortcut to say, okay, here's a way to understand who I am, not all of who I am, but, my personality style, so that we can, get farther faster in a way.
Yes. You beat me to the punch. I was just thinking about the fact that you are both a therapist and a corporate consultant, and that really gives you a wide view, both on the micro and how the Enneagram might play out for one person or in a couple dyad, as well as on an entire team or within an organization. I'm wondering if you could share a story of the before and after knowing about the Enneagram, whether it's for a couple or for a business team, where it really made a big difference.
Sure. Maybe I'll tell a couple quick ones, one for a couple and one for a business team. So one time I was working with a couple, and they'd been doing really good work in couples therapy, but we had been in therapy a while, and I would say hadn't made a lot of progress. Now, progress in terms of they were very open and talking with each other and making themselves vulnerable. But at one point I thought, maybe I'll teach them the Enneagram. So we learned the Enneagram, they found their types, they started talking about it with their individual therapists. And actually, so we had maybe been in therapy, as they had been in therapy with me as a couple for a couple of years. And once they learned about the Enneagram, they broke up within a few months.
Wow.
And when they broke up, they were amazing. They were very courageous. And they basically said to me, we want you to think of this as a successful therapy, because this needed to happen.
Yes.
Like we were sort of putting this off for a long time, but this is actually the right thing for us. And we didn't see it until we learned the Enneagram, and we saw what the patterns really were. We were involved in. So one of them, one partner learned she was a 2, and the other partner learned he was a 6, and they could just see how their 2 and 6 patterns were playing out, and how that was sort of keeping them stuck. And once they saw that, it was still work, but it was quick work to realize, okay, this isn't working. Here's why. It's painful. We love each other. We don't want to split apart, but it is the best thing. And so that was an example of that. I would say there was a business team I worked with once that, so one of the people on the team knew the Enneagram well. He was one of the top leaders. It was a leadership team of a venture capital organization. And there was another guy on the team that the leader and another guy weren't getting along with. So there was an ongoing conflict in this team. Now, I came in and taught the Enneagram, and the guy they were having a problem with was a bit of a skeptic at first. And he asked a lot of questions, and I had a lot of answering questions to do. But then he realized that he was a 1. And it was a huge revelation to the 2 guys that were having an issue with him, because they had thought he was a different type. And once they saw he was a 1, all of a sudden, what they were really arguing about, what the conflict was really about, became clear. And they understood this guy in a completely new way. they had a completely new conversation about not only what the conflict was really about, but also how to solve it, which ended up being pretty easy once they knew what it was really about. And a while later, I talked to the leader of the team, and he said, you know, we were really having a problem with that guy, and we were thinking we couldn't work with him anymore. But after that, we did that. Not only did we keep him on the team and did we work really, really well together, but that guy is now one of our most valuable assets in terms of how we work on the team and the things that we need in our organization. So I thought that was it was very interesting that it very quickly kind of turned this whole situation around.
Just a paradigm shift around who this person was. And just to your earlier point, in couples therapy, a lot of people think that the goal of couples therapy is exclusively to salvage the relationship. And of course, we as therapists are always rooting for that. And yet sometimes the success is the clarity of both partners to say, wow, this is actually not going to work. And that's a different form of therapeutic success, even though it's not a conventional determination of what we would ordinarily consider successful, and that they had the insight to recognize, wow, yeah, we got what we could from this relationship, and now we free each other to actually explore happiness elsewhere. And that in and of itself, due to the Enneagram, is therapeutic success. It's funny also, my wife and I are different Enneatypes, as you might imagine, and before I was really well versed in the Enneagram, before I knew her type, I was so befuddled by her idea of fun. Her idea of fun is crossing stuff off lists and kicking some major butt and doing amazing stuff and task orientation. And my idea is sitting in the backyard in a hammock, listening to some chill music and just zoning out. I'm a 7 and she's a 3. And when we learned this and when we learned our subtypes, which we'll talk about later, it became even more evident where we needed just to appreciate the other. And I'm wondering if you could share, in terms of within the context of relationship, perhaps a couple who was previously struggling and then upon seeing the Enneagram recognized, oh wow, this is kind of like a potluck where each of us brings a different dish to the meal. And even though I really love barbecue and that's the dish I'm bringing, I'm so glad she's bringing wine or something like that. Can you share perhaps a different form of success story where a couple actually became closer?
Yeah. I think I worked with a couple once, and they were a 7 and a 6. You know, and so as you know, with 7s, they're looking at the positive data and wanting to see things and wanting to see the glass is half full, and the 6 is often looking at the negative data and wanting to see the glass as half empty, or just they have a tendency to see it as half empty for good reason. And then, of course, you can see how that would polarize, you know, and couples do tend to polarize. The more I see it in the positive lens, the more I feel like I need to see the negative data because you're not seeing it. And this couple realized that they were doing that once they learned their Enneagram type, and they could then understand there's a reason why you're always looking at the positive data.
Right.
Good reasons for that. And there's a way it works for you. And the same thing with the person who's looking, because sometimes 7s think like, why would you ever want to look on the dark side? You know, why would you ever want to go looking for a problem or something negative? But there are good reasons 6s have to do that. And it's usually they're trying to be helpful to the couple or the family by pointing out what might go wrong ahead of time so they can be prepared. And so once they really understood where each other was coming from, what they realized is when they would have these points of disagreements, they would just kind of have to, they even had a phrase for it. They said, they would each say to themselves, I need to get over myself. And it was really like, I need to get over my ego. I need to see how my ego is it's so focused on a particular angle on this. That when I'm really stressed or in the stress of an argument, I get even more dug in on, no, it's got to be the most positive view. No, well, the more you see the positive, the more I'm going to point out the negative because you're not seeing it. That's a problem, right? And so once they were able to see that, they could really see how both people were bringing something important to the situation, and then they could use that insight to help each other. right? So the 6 could say to the 7, I think there are times when you're over indexing the positive data and you're overlooking something that's really important that we need to talk about, and if we don't talk about it, it's going to create more of a problem. And the 7 could really appreciate that and realize, okay, I just need to see that my lens, even though, like, as a 7, I think, why would you ever look at anything negative? I can see that that is just my framing of things, and that I need to kind of get over that and see a broader view and understand that you're bringing something really important to me by helping me see things that I wouldn't normally see. And so they helped each other in that way, and they started to see themselves more as a team.
It's so interesting as you're describing this, I immediately saw the 9 positions on a baseball team and recognized that you wouldn't want a team full of 9 pitchers. You'd want a team with different positions and different abilities. And a catcher wouldn't look at a shortstop and say, why aren't you a better catcher like I am with a catcher's mitt? The shortstop is doing a vastly different thing, as is the center fielder. And so I guess as you were describing the 7 and the 6, each of them, it sounds like, kind of came around to recognizing that they could be less invested in being right about their position and more able to get over themselves and see what the other person is bringing. And there was a better bridging process through that.
Right. And more mutual understanding, more mutual appreciation, and a broadening of perspective, and a reminder that when we get into conflicts, we often need to get over our entrenched ego position and see it from a greater height.
Totally. And, and being in a relationship, I just know I'm right about things. And the fact is, obviously, I'm not. And
we're not 100% of the time.
It's certainly not. And all of that learning takes place in the context of relationship if we're willing to learn. And I think the Enneagram really serves as a great tool. I'm wondering also about skeptics who might say, you know what? It's a typing system. It's going to try to put me in a box and label me. What do you say to those folks who might be skeptical in that way around the Enneagram?
Yeah, that's a common reaction, and it's understandable. Nobody wants to be stereotyped or pigeonholed. But what I would say to those people, and what I think Enneagram enthusiasts would say is, well, the Enneagram doesn't put you in a box. You're actually already in a box, but you just don't know you're in a box. And that's part of the problem, is you're in a box, not knowing you're in a box, and it can't get out if you don't even know you're in a box. And the Enneagram helps you see the box you're in so that you can get out of it.
Yeah. And I've heard of that process is being described as evolution, like evolving beyond your type by knowing your type. Is that consistent with your understanding of it?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's important to know, even just in understanding the Enneagram types, is that we're more than our personality. Who you are is not equal to your personality. But the problem is that, until we know better, we tend to identify with our personality and think that's all of who we are.
Yeah.
And so the good news, the Enneagram actually brings a lot of good news. It's actually a system of liberation, because you don't recognize, because all of us, we take on coping strategies in childhood, depending on what our type is.
Right.
And we just kind of keep doing the same things over and over again because it worked and because that's all we know and it's what's familiar and comfortable. But the Enneagram helps highlight how, that works in some ways. And in some ways, that it's something, our personality points to some strengths that we have. But there are also ways in that it doesn't work, or it's limited, or it's a perspective that doesn't take into account different points of view. And by helping us see that, it helps us recognize that we are limiting ourselves unnecessarily when we don't do the personal growth work of recognizing what our patterns and habits are, such that we can learn to make different choices if we want to.
That's great. And are there any other misconceptions about the Enneagram? And if so, how do you attend to those?
I think sometimes people are just not sure they want to be more known, either by themselves or others. And so I think anyone who has a resistance to doing inner growth work, to being more vulnerable, as we said, to to, in some ways, encountering their pain. Because when you do inner growth work, as you know, as a therapist,
Yep.
it involves facing your pain. And a lot of when we get stuck in our personality patterns, it's a lot about the fact that we want to stay comfortable and we don't want to feel pain. And again, on the one hand, it's important to understand that and empathize with who would, of course, it's just human nature to not want it, to take your finger off the stove, to not want to feel pain.
Definitely.
And yet it's definitely a no pain, no gain thing. So I think when people see the Enneagram, sometimes they say, oh, it's negative. And I don't want to, it's too negative. But the truth is it describes ego games, and so and your ego is in some ways helping you get through life,
sure,
which is a good thing. But in other ways, it's keeping you stuck in a narrowed perspective. It's that what's behind your defensiveness when you don't want to grow, or you don't want to notice if you're wrong, or you don't want to apologize.
Sure.
And so I think sometimes we have to see some of what doesn't feel so good in us. And I think sometimes people, when they describe it as negative, it's like, I only really want to look at my strengths, and I don't really want to see some of, what hurts, or what makes me mad, or what makes me sad, or and I think that when you use the Enneagram for inner work, by definition, that's why it's so powerful. It brings us in contact with our shadow, with the parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily want to see and accept, but that's what's so good about it. And if people can recognize that's the invitation and an opportunity, and that if you're willing, it's no pain, no gain. If you're willing to go through some discomfort, learn to tolerate some difficult feelings, there's no end to the growth that can happen. And you can really manifest much more of your higher potential because you're willing to push through that what's blocking you, which is your defensive reactions when you get to sort of those limits, your edges that you don't want to encounter because it's hard, it's painful.
I'm going to poorly paraphrase a quote from the great Carl Jung, who was the great explorer of the human shadow. And he said that we don't get to kind of an enlightened state by exploring the light. We get through it by really knowing the dark. And you're speaking very well to that idea. I'm wondering, how might a lot of people might experience those trepidations about getting to know themselves, about going into that dark cave, that they'd rather just say, it's not really there. How might you encourage someone to go in and check it out and get to know themselves more deeply?
Well, I think one of the things you can do is you can paint a picture of how much more freedom and peace and happiness and freedom from anxiety and depression and other things that you can find when you really work on yourself, that you are, if you can help people see that while it may feel good to stay comfortable, they're also living a life that's more limited, maybe more stressful, more difficult than it could be. It's sort of like we often say, my teaching partner and I, when we work with people, let in suffering so it can go away.
Wow. Elaborate on that idea. Let in suffering so it can go away. I mean, you spoke about putting your hand on the hot burning stove. Let in suffering so it can go away. I'm really taken with that.
Right. Because oftentimes to really grow, we need to go through difficult emotions. We need to encounter them. We need to understand what they mean, because emotions bring information. So if you can let in suffering, if you can, grief or sadness or anger, or pain, if you can let that in and find out, what does this have to teach me? What is it telling me? Then you can move through it and get to the other side, and it's delivered its message, it's done its job, and it goes away. But when people resist difficult feelings, they stay and they create more and more problems. So it's like, let in your suffering, feel that grief so that eventually it can pass through you, and then you get to the other side. And I think sometimes as a therapist, I noticed a lot of times that people who felt a lot of anxiety, one reason for feeling anxiety was they were avoiding feeling important emotions. it's sort of like, I know there's some sadness in there, but I really don't want to look. And as long as I'm not looking, I'm going to be in this anxiety. But if I can push through the anxiety and get into the sadness and really feel it and really cry or really, be in it for a little while, then it goes away. It's sort of like they say, there's that spiritual saying, don't identify with the clouds, identify with the sky. Like feelings, difficult feelings are clouds that pass through. And if you welcome them and you understand what they mean for you, and by the way, all the Enneagram types have different patterns in terms of what emotions they tend to feel more easily and what feelings they tend to avoid. If you can go toward those feelings you avoid and have a conscious process of understanding what they mean and working through them, then you're free on the other side.
I love your image of the clouds. I've not heard that one actually, and I've certainly heard the only way out is through. I've heard that avoidance or resistance is at the root of all suffering, and you're kind of speaking to that as well. I'm also kind of thinking about the person who decides to not really engage their mind, but rather sit on the couch with the remote in hand, versus the other person who either picks up a book or engages in a difficult conversation, or who goes to the gym and works musculature. I mean, just the act of lifting weights or exercising is the breaking down, the painful process of lactic acid showing up and making you stronger. It sounds like it's a very similar process.
Yes, definitely. It's a little bit like weightlifting, emotional weightlifting, right?
I buy that. And I've often referred to therapy as, not for anybody who's less than courageous. It takes a lot of courage to go into therapy. Absolutely. Because I just love that image. I may not resonate with some people who haven't seen the movie, but in The Empire Strikes Back, the second Star Wars film, there's a scene in which Luke Skywalker goes into Yoda's cave and must confront his own shadow. And it's just painful. I love that scene so much because it really speaks to what you're talking about, the ability to confront the dark, to confront the part that you'd rather disavow and say does not exist.
Right.
And the Enneagram is a really fast way to do it. There's so many, just a bit of a pivot here, there's so many personality typing systems, the Myers-Briggs, the DISC, the Big Five. I'm just kind of wondering, what are the strengths, perhaps relative to those within the Enneagram? Not to disparage the others, but to just say, how does the Enneagram differentiate itself?
Sure. So I have to confess, I don't know a lot about the other systems because, I encountered the Enneagram, way before, I hadn't even studied psychology before I studied the Enneagram. So, but from what I've heard in terms of people I know and businesses I've worked in, like one leader I worked with said that he used the DISC some of the time.
Sure.
But he found it to be sort of a little bit more simple and more superficial. So there are some teams when it was just like as an introductory thing or something, an intervention that was more simple, that he would use that, versus the Enneagram is more sophisticated and it required a little bit more time and energy. And so he would bring that in other situations when that was required. Now, I happen to do a lot of, I partner with a team of people who are specialists in the Myers-Briggs. I don't know if you've heard of Personality Hacker, Antonia Dodge and Joel Mark Witt. They're good friends of mine. And so I know a lot of what I know about the Myers-Briggs through them. And they are great people to know about if you like the Myers-Briggs, because they've done a lot of pioneering work in making the Myers-Briggs more growth-oriented. I think sometimes the way the Myers-Briggs is used in organizations, it's used rather superficially and not necessarily as a growth model. So it's sort of like it's more descriptive, like here are some traits and this is how you might differ from this person. And I think a lot of times it gets used as, there's an offsite, we all learn our Myers-Briggs types and we learn something interesting, but it doesn't really last. It doesn't really seep into the culture of the organization. Whereas the Enneagram, I've had leaders that have used it and they've said when it's been recommended to them, the way it's been recommended is like it said that like the Enneagram has legs. There's a way that it's so growth oriented. It is a developmental map. It's not just for description. And people who use it that way are really doing it an injustice and themselves an injustice. because the Enneagram is all about growth and development. And so I would say a lot of the other typologies aren't as thoroughgoing. They're not as deep. They don't tell you as much. And they don't have like very specific growth tasks associated with the different types they describe. Now, of course, one of the reasons why I think the Enneagram is really different than a lot of the others is that it has ancient roots. Now it depends on who you ask, you get different stories, but I think it's maybe thousands of years old, the sort of wisdom behind the symbol, and as a model of transformation. So I think because it's been around so long and it speaks to these kind of really deep questions about sort of why are we here and what is the possibility of transformation for a human being, I think it's more profound. It's like as much time and energy as you put into studying the Enneagram, you will keep getting more and more and more out of it. Whereas I think with some other tools, there may be a little more of a limit.
There's just so much to learn about it, and it seems like the information is endless. One of the other differentiators, and please correct me if I'm incorrect, that I've known is that some people's Myers-Briggs types have switched. They've gone from introvert to extrovert over time, or vice versa, more likely, or they've gone from feeling to thinking over time because of certain life experiences. And my understanding of the Enneagram is your type is stable throughout time. You may evolve, you may escape some of the trappings, but once a 2, always a 2, although some of the traits within the 2 you may have more mastery over. Is that right? Consistent with your understanding?
Yes, I would say that. Again, I'm not an expert in the Myers-Briggs, but I have heard people who have switched their types over time, or they took a test at one point and they took a test at a later point and they were a different type. And yes, with the Enneagram, you don't change types, you evolve within one type.
It's been interesting to have children of my own who have presented with Enneatypes very early on. Is that consistent with your understanding that the Enneatype seems to appear very early on? If you actually kind of connect the dots going backwards, that you could see that you were probably a 2 long before you recognized it and had the typing system available.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I believe, and I mean, I can't prove this, but I believe that we are born with our type and maybe even our subtype. And certainly that's what I see. I don't have children, but my brother does. And I'm very close to my niece and nephew. And when my nephew in particular was born, he was the first sort of grandchild in the family. I could tell from day one, like from 2 years old, or maybe even before that he was a self-preservation 9.
Yeah.
To me, it was right there. Now I tend to see through that lens, but of course I didn't say anything to him. So it wasn't like I was influencing him or anything, but just so many of the things that he did from day one, I could just fit into that style. And it was, I found it very endearing actually. But yeah, I think it starts very early. Of course our, we know now that it's nature and nurture. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not like it's one or the other. I think obviously our environment shapes us in many important ways, but I do think when it comes to what type you are, it's with us from the beginning.
So you spoke about subtypes, and we're not going to unpack all 9 types during this episode. That would be an episode unto itself. Probably would take at least 50 minutes just to go through all the 9 types and give it the appropriate amount of time. But the subtypes, there are 3 subtypes, which essentially 3 times 9 equals 27. And you basically have noted that there are actually 27 different types. Putting that aside, would you be comfortable describing the subtypes, especially since they seem to be more relevant in the context of relationships, perhaps even than the types themselves?
Yeah, I think this is an important dimension of the Enneagram. And so what the subtypes are, so for each of the 9 types, basically it's the idea that there are 3 versions of each of the 9 types. Yeah. So there are 3 kinds of 1s, there are 3 kinds of 2s, 3 kinds of 3s, 3 kinds of 6s, etc. And those 3 are distinguished by which of one of 3 instincts is most prominent in their experience. And so these are 3 instincts that we all of us humans have as animals. The instinct for self-preservation, or conservation of ourselves and our survival, an instinct, a social instinct. It's about getting along with the group or the herd. Where am I positioned? How am I relating to the herd? And of course, in the animal world, we see this when, sort of herds run together. And of course, they're not talking, but they're just moving together. Birds move together. Schools of fish move together. That's the social instinct. And of course, they survive better if they're in a group.
Yes.
And I think in previous eras of human history, that was probably clear also to humans. Now I think we're in a more self-preservation oriented era where it's a little bit every man for himself in some ways. But of course, I think what's happening in the world today is making us realize we're really more all in it together than not. But there were eras in history where you didn't survive if you weren't in a tribe. And so it's a tribal, it's a focus on the collective and the social instinct. And then there's a one-to-one instinct, or sometimes we call it sexual instinct. It's really the sexual instinct, but when I'm working in a business setting or a setting where sexual doesn't make sense to say, I'll call it the one-to-one instinct. But basically it's about one-to-one bonding. It's about rivalry in the animal world. It's about competition. It's about, there's a kind of intensity of wanting to connect very deeply for, both for reproduction, but companionship. And it's a kind of creative force or instinct. And so these three instincts are all in all of us. But just like for each of us, we tend to come from more than one center of intelligence more than the other two. And then within that center of intelligence, we identify with one type more than the other two. It's like another breakdown into three. When we have a type where usually one of these three instincts kind of dominates our experience, and one is sort of in the second place and one is more repressed. And we use the word repressed because we do believe it's sort of kept out of awareness. This is a biological drive, and you almost have to exert some force to not be aware of one of them. But one tends to be repressed, and the whole sequence is often interesting to know about. So for instance, I'm a self-preservation too. And so learning about what the self-preservation instinct was important, but even more so, and this is a big caveat, you need to not just think about what the three instincts are like generally, because when you apply it, when they show up within a type, they can look really different. So this is why the 27 subtypes are good to know, because, self-preservation instinct, there are some things we can say that might be true of everyone who has that as a dominant instinct. However, if you're talking about a 3 versus a 7 versus a 9, they're going to look really different the way those play out. So that's I think I see so many times in the Enneagram world where people focus too much on the instincts because it's easy to understand these 3 categories, much easier than 27. But we need to really recognize that once you combine this, once the instinct is working through the personality type and the personality type structure, it's controlled to some degree by the emotional patterns of the type. And so that makes it show up a bit differently. And so it's almost like we're talking about the instinct in the context of personality, and it gets kind of distorted when our ego gets involved. And it's sort of like the subtype is ego plus instinctual drive, and not just a kind of raw instinctual drive.
So you have been very well schooled in various facets of psychology, and yet you chose to do a deep dive in the Enneagram. What caused you to go all in with this?
Well, I learned the Enneagram 6 years before I studied psychology, and it was really the Enneagram that caused me to shift my career path. So it was sort of like the Enneagram made me decide to study psychology, and it wasn't like I studied psychology and then picked the Enneagram. So the Enneagram is what got me interested in becoming more studying psychology and working with people as a psychotherapist, because I thought I just saw what could be done, what could be achieved through the lens of the Enneagram. And, once you see something that works so well, it's like, why mess with anything else?
Yeah.
Now, I do think the Enneagram is not a standalone tool. I think you need to be a therapist or a coach or something. You need to get some other training, because the Enneagram is like a tool that you apply in the context of, having more training on how to support people in their growth process. But I would say that it was a no-brainer for me to be working with the Enneagram, because it is such an effective tool. And, I learned it from Dr. Daniels, who I know you probably know, Dr. David Daniels.
For sure.
He was one of the first teachers. And he used to say, he was a psychiatrist at Stanford. And he said, I see the Enneagram as my calling. And he would say that he never saw anything that was more effective at helping people become more self-aware, do inner work. And it's the same thing for me. It's like I was hooked from word one, because I could see how clarifying it was. To me, it brings a kind of, it also kind of reconnected me to my spirituality. So for me, it's like a psycho-spiritual tool. Now you can talk about it in completely psychological terms or completely spiritual terms, or both at the same time, or neither. When I work in business, I don't really use either psychological or spiritual language. It's more of a practical tool. But it had such depth, and it almost gave me sort of it confirmed my belief in a higher order, seeing the way the Enneagram was. There's a mathematics behind it. It's part of sacred arithmetic. There's so much in it that I think is so profound that it was something I could trust. And it was something that I saw that yielded results in such powerful ways that I never really saw anything else do.
I would corroborate that in my own experience. I give out Dave Daniels' book, May His Memory Be a Blessing. He was just a really important bridge between the medical world and the academic world and the Enneagram, and bringing it out to the masses. His books on pages 4 through 7 has a self-assessment that I give out quite consistently to people, just to deepen the work, and it always does. I'm wondering, has there been any research done on the Enneagram itself?
I think there's been research done here and there on it. I think it's a hard thing. Like when I in my PhD, I studied communication, which was a kind of a mixture of sociology and political science in my case. So I was in the social sciences, and I found it was really hard to study social phenomena in the way we study, say, the phenomena of the natural world.
Sure.
It's not as easily, as measured and quantified. And I think the Enneagram is hard to study scientifically because of that. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and it's good that some people are. But I think that, as Helen Palmer used to say, the Enneagram is self-verifying. In other words, you read the description and you can just see it, in your patterns. I even had a guy at a business who was a skeptic originally when he learned the Enneagram, and later when I did another thing with his team, someone else said, has this been scientifically validated? And this original skeptic said, it doesn't really have to be. You can just see it, that it works. You can just see that these patterns are playing out all the time. So I'm not someone who's that interested in scientific validation, but I applaud the efforts that people who are. I haven't seen very much, again, just because I think it's a challenging process of getting sort of quantifiable data of something that is sort of, just more about, personality and human behavior. It's just a difficult thing.
What you're describing makes a lot of sense. It's almost like asking yourself, do we really need to do a large-scale qualitative or quantitative study when people are trying on the garments and they fit? They just fit as if they, and we know that somebody's an L, somebody's an M, somebody wears a size 16, and we just know that this fits. And so it sounds like you have not seen really exceptions to that generally speaking, when people do a deep dive into the Enneagram, they will find a type that really fits. In some cases, maybe whether they like it or not.
Yeah. I think the only time people don't find a type that fits is if they don't want to.
Exactly.
And that's a valid choice, really.
Right.
Yeah, but it's not the same as the Enneagram not being valid. Now, I do know that there are some circumstances where people want to use the Enneagram, say in a university or a company or a prison, where the higher ups say, well, is this tool valid? You know, and I know that's a real question for some people. I just think it's hard, but I do think that some people are in the process of trying to find some evidence that we can point to.
So yeah, and there are one of the things I've just got to know, B. There have been many books written on the Enneagram, and yet you invested so much time in writing a massive book, and yet another book, and I believe 2 more books coming out in the not so distant future. What has given? Yeah, how did you decide that you wanted to create your contribution? What gave you that conviction to put your hat in the ring? And by the way, 5-star average on Amazon. So hats off to you. What made you decide to do that?
Thanks. Well, it was not easy to decide to do that. And I really appreciate your question. I talked many sessions with my therapist talking about, like, should I really be writing this book? But I would say that, and a lot of people literally said to me, I don't think we need another Enneagram book. Right. And so I think that right there, though, that mindset is a little problematic, because I think the Enneagram is something that we are still decoding, that there's a lot of information in it, and we need more efforts to make it both more comprehensible and more usable, and also evolve the theory. But the reasons I wrote The Complete Enneagram, which is my first book, were twofold. One is I thought there weren't very many books out, like thorough books about the Enneagram types that, and especially how to help them grow, that had been written by someone who is a working psychotherapist. I thought I had a lot of insights to share based on the work I had done with many clients and myself over many years. So I thought, and I wanted to build a bridge to therapists. I wanted to sort of speak a little bit more their language, although I also wanted it to be an experience for people who didn't necessarily have a psychological education, but that were just maybe psychologically savvy or interested. Now, the other big reason I decided to write it is because of the subtypes. So, from 1990, when I learned the Enneagram, to about 2004, in my own Enneagram education, I found what was taught under the name of subtypes to be lacking. I didn't get very much out of it. I wondered why they were even mentioning it, because there wasn't much information about it available. Different teachers talked about it in different ways. It seemed to me that there wasn't much substance to the subtypes. And I certainly didn't see how I couldn't find which one I was, and I couldn't see how it would help me grow. So I'm like, why are they talking about this when there's nothing really much there?
Yeah.
But that changed in 2004 when Claudio Naranjo, who was the original person who really gave us, I think, the versions of the 9 types we all work with today. He returned to the International Enneagram Association conference in Washington, D.C., and he did a 3-morning workshop on subtypes with about 15 of his collaborators from around the world. And Naranjo had been developing his understanding of the 27 subtypes for many years, basically in isolation from the American Enneagram community, which is a little bit a leader in the global community, although he taught a lot in Europe and South America. But when I heard his version in 2004 of what he was describing in the 27 subtypes, it was completely different than anything I had heard talked about. And it was really amazingly helpful for me in my inner growth journey. So it just revolutionized the work I was doing on myself. And the things he was saying about all the types were shockingly amazing to me. And then I thought, well, this will change everything. But then after that conference, everyone went right back to just talking about the subtypes the way they always had. It was as if it hadn't happened. And that infuriated me, because I thought, I'm an academic, and I'm thinking, okay, the seminal author comes in and gives us an influx of this new, rich information that deepens the study and the work to be done. And we all ignore it like it didn't happen. And I couldn't wrap my head around that. And so as an academic, I went on a mission to get every piece of information I could that Naranjo had publicized about the subtypes. And it wasn't easy because he wasn't very consistent. Like in some books, he would talk about it about some types, but not about the other types. And, you know, transcribing 5-day workshops he did in other languages. So I could gather all that information, and I thought, okay, how am I going to put this information out there? And so I thought I need to write a book where I'm basically, and the whole book, The Complete Enneagram, is really an argument for a return to making the work of Claudio Naranjo central in the Enneagram work. Because I think he was a psychiatrist and a, you know, leader in the human potential movement. He was a pioneer in Gestalt therapy. He knew a lot about spirituality and philosophy and music and all kinds of things. And so he really, I think, articulates both the 9 types and the 27 subtypes in a way that nobody else has. And so it was sort of I wanted to make his insights about the 27 types available to everybody, because I wanted them to have the growth experience I had. So I needed to put a book out there, I thought, to really get the word out. And so those two things were really motivated me to write the first book.
Oh my gosh, B, as you're describing this, because this is audio only, what the listener can't see is I'm grinning ear to ear as you're sharing this with me, partially because I feel like I'm eating popcorn and watching an Indiana Jones movie about this person who went and collected all of this, all of this buried data that needed to be maintained and passed along. It sounds like that's exactly what you did. Yeah. You found all of this buried data that might not have been available to us.
Yeah.
And you shared it.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. That's a huge gift. Before I get to my final question, I have a question that I love asking. It's formulaic, but it can be revealing. Is there anything I haven't asked that I should have asked during the course of this interview?
I think you've asked excellent questions, and I like the range of questions. I can't think of anything. I mean, I think the heart of the matter is what an effective tool the Enneagram is for real growth, and I think we've touched on that from different angles. So I can't think of anything.
Then here's the one I haven't asked so far. B, in your dreams, how would you like to see the Enneagram used in the future?
Wow, that's a great question, and I haven't thought much of it about that. One thing I would like to see is I would like to see a little bit more uniformity and around the best Enneagram theory and the sort of more collective effort in moving theory forward. For instance, I think over the history of the Enneagram in the last 30 years or so, there hasn't really, it's not an academic discipline. There aren't any standards for what good theory is. And so some people have just said, okay, I'm going to create these new words for this, or I'm going to focus on this and create this different dimension. I don't want to say what their motives were, but
sure.
Sometimes it's like, this is my thing,
Exactly.
And I'm making it a little bit differently. Right. Now I'm an academic, and I think you don't just make up your own thing. You have to build on what's come before in an orderly fashion. And you have to honor what's come before. And if you want to change something, you can do that, but you have to make a really good argument for it. You have to say why, and you have to even maybe open yourself up to critique from the community to see whether that's a good thing or not, your change or your development or your innovation. So I guess I would like to see the best theory used by the most people. I would like to see people really recognizing that the Enneagram is not a shallow matter, that it's not something to be used superficially or lightly, that this is sort of serious business, and that people respect what it is and work together in community to really use it in the best possible ways, to have like high standards. For instance, anyone can get on Instagram today and write something about the Enneagram. I think there's an explosion of interest among young people right now in the Enneagram, and I think that's fantastic. But I want those people, and I think many of them are, to their credit, to be asking, what's the source of this information? What are the qualifications of the person who's creating this Enneagram content? Are they trustworthy, or are they just someone who likes the Enneagram and they had an idea and they're going with it? You know, I think we need to be relying on people who've studied it a long time, people who have training in one area or another, whether it's spiritual direction or therapy or psychology or coaching or organization development, and be bringing it together with a lot of high standards for keeping the depth and quality of the work done with the Enneagram, because I think otherwise, you know, we can do harm, or we can think we're doing good work when we're really not doing much at all.
Oh, I love that answer. So really coming up with standards and keeping it from being a little bit less of a, I hate to use the term, of a Wild West situation where people can just put their own take on it and say, this is, that would really add, you know, I think I was wrong when I said that was my last question. I'm just going to ask you one last hypothetical, because I just got to. Here's my truly last question. Hypothetically, if everyone in the world knew their type and subtype, how do you think that might improve society?
Wow. Well, I mean, I think the whole reason I'm so committed to doing the work I do and working with the Enneagram in the world is because I really believe when each person is doing their individual work and is more conscious of themselves, it makes the whole world a better place. So I think we may be headed in that kind of direction, in that we're becoming more conscious and less unconscious. And I think that's the way it would be. I think that you'd have more conscious people. Now, of course, people can know their type and subtype and not do much with it.
Right.
But hopefully, if they know that much, you know, they're able to own their shit more, you know, be able to take responsibility for themselves as opposed to blame others, which is sometimes that we do, I think, when we're coming from like a more base part of our personality. And I think we'd be kinder and gentler and more understanding of each other. Oh,
Chestunut, I'm so happy that we had this interview. I can't thank you enough. You are a gift. You're a gift to me, but you're a gift really to everyone who comes in contact with you, and now to the listeners of Super Psyched. Thank you so much for giving your time and your expertise.
Thank you, Adam. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate what you're doing with this podcast, so thank you.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. To listen to other great episodes or to get more information about today's episode, please visit me at my website, dradamdorsey.com. That's DradamDorsay.com, and click the Super Psyched podcast link.